Hello and welcome to Sophie Ridge on Sunday. There's a new Prime Minister, a new cabinet and new priorities. And number one on that list is planning for a no-deal Brexit. Boris Johnson has set up a war cabinet to take the UK out of the EU by the end of October by any means necessary. Like it or not, the Brexit temperature has been cranked up a few notches. So we've got a blockbuster show today. First, we'll be hearing from the Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Not content with just one party leader, we'll also be speaking to the new Lib Dem leader, Jo Swinson. And one of the cabinet's new faces, Rishi Sunak, will also be here in the studio. And with no-deal preparations ramping up, we'll get the view from Europe with the French MEP and the former Europe Minister, Nathalie Loiseau. But first, this week I travelled to Mansfield, one of the key marginal constituencies that could decide the next election, and I sat down with the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. I started by asking about that election, which might not be too far away. So you're now on your third Conservative Prime Minister. Boris Johnson seems to be gearing up for an election. Are you?
Absolutely. I've got my summer campaign plan in place. We've got most of our candidates selected in all our marginal constituencies. We have many of our policy announcements in place, particularly the ones on the Green Industrial Revolution and the Green New Deal that we're putting forward, and working out more details on our health and social care policies. But fundamentally, it's about reducing inequality in Britain and about investing in good quality, sustainable jobs for the future through the green energy revolution.
Are you a bit worried about going up against Boris Johnson in an election? I mean, he's won in Labour territory before in London.
Not in the slightest. We'll go out there and we'll make our case. I don't get involved in personal abuse. I don't make any personal abuse. I don't do personal. As far as I'm concerned, the issues are too serious. We live in a country that is more unequal than almost any other in Europe. That is becoming more unequal. That in many parts of the country there's been no real investment since the end of the miners' strike. Where we are today in Mansfield as an example of that. We have to have a change of approach, and it has to be about investment, it has to be about real opportunities for young people so they don't go into university and come out with debt. They do get the choice, a real choice, of an apprenticeship or a university education.
I mean, we're in Mansfield, as you say, somewhere that was Labour for 94 years before the Conservatives took it at the last election. How are you going to win seats like this back?
Our candidate here, Sonia Wood, working really hard. All of our party members working really hard, taking that message out there. We don't have to be a nation of food banks. I met somebody an hour ago who was organising a hunger holiday campaign in order to collect food to ensure that children who would normally get free school meals managed to get a lunch all through the school holidays. Modern Britain, 21st century, fifth richest country in the world. That is simply wrong. It's these inequalities that have to be dealt with. So
it's pretty clear that you want an election. So when are you going to make it happen? When are you going to call a no-confidence vote in the Prime Minister?
Parliament goes back in September, and I think it's at that point we'll look at the situation there. But it's also up to the Prime Minister what he decides to do as well, because if he's trying to take us out on a no-deal Brexit at the end of October, we will oppose that.
So can you guarantee that you'll call a confidence motion before we leave the EU in October?
I can guarantee you this, we will do everything to prevent a no-deal exit, and we'll do everything to challenge this government, and we'll do it at a time of our choosing.
OK. So when do you think the election's going to be then?
Well, an election takes about 7 weeks from the point at which Parliament votes to hold it under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and 2/3 of all MPs have to vote for it. But if the government puts down such a motion, we would support it because we think the public do deserve an election. We have a government that doesn't really have a majority, that has a deal made with the DUP some years ago and cannot win votes in Parliament. Theresa May was defeated more times than any other Prime Minister by the biggest majorities ever. And Johnson has put together a cabinet of ideologically extremely right-wing people, and the leader of the House, instead of getting on with reforming Parliament, seems more concerned about apostrophes at the end of letters.
OK. Now, let's talk about Brexit, shall we? Because when that election comes, Brexit will be of utmost importance to many people, including people here in Mansfield, which voted 70% to leave the EU. They're going to want to know what your policy is on Brexit. So what is it? Are you now supporting a second referendum in all circumstances?
What we're saying is, no deal we'd oppose, and we would think the people should have a final choice on it. And they could have a vote then between Remain or whatever option Boris Johnson decides to put to them at that time. What I'd also say to Mansfield and to everywhere else is, you've not had the investment you should have had. British governments have walked by on the other side and not invested in good quality jobs since the end of the coal industry. But you also need a government that's going to invest in the future to reduce those inequalities. It's a Labour government that will invest in the future. And we need to maintain a trading relationship with Europe, a trading relationship for our manufacturing industry and for our food processing and food industries as well. Also, issues like medicine supply. And of course, the Northern Ireland border is a key issue. And any deal that damages the Belfast Agreement, which is an international treaty, is simply not going to work.
OK, I just want to bring you back to my question. Does Labour now back a second referendum in all circumstances?
What I would say is there will be a second referendum to make a choice between whatever deal is arranged and what the public want.
Including a Labour deal if you are in power?
Well, if we're in power, yes, of course, the same thing would apply, because I want to make sure that we get to the end of this process where we have a fixed position in this country. I have spent the last 2 years trying to ensure that we put forward the Labour view, which was a customs union with the European Union, trade access and protection of rights. That was the one that got the best vote in Parliament but didn't gain a majority. Theresa May's proposals were roundly defeated on 3 occasions.
So if you do want to see a second referendum in all circumstances, how are you going to campaign in that? You're a man who's been campaigning all your life. Are you going to be campaigning for Leave, or are you going to be campaigning for Remain?
What we said is, in the event of the no-deal Brexit, we'll campaign to Remain.
But what if Labour negotiates a deal?
Well, we've got to get into office first to negotiate a deal.
You see,
and we've got to win an election first. If we win an election, then we'll reopen those talks with the European Union. But at the moment, the danger is a no-deal exit on the 31st of October with all the problems that that brings.
I understand that you're opposed to no deal, but where my head starts to hurt slightly is I'm still struggling to see exactly what is in Jeremy Corbyn's heart when it comes to Brexit. I mean, it's crystal clear what Boris Johnson wants, like it or not. It's crystal clear what Joe Swinson wants. What does Jeremy Corbyn want? Do you want to stay in the EU or do you want to leave?
Investment, jobs, trade and equality, both in or out of the EU. I want those things, but I go back to the point.
But it makes a difference if you're in or out, doesn't it? You can't just say you want investment and opportunity in or out. I mean,
what we
it matters if we're in
was
or out.
actually a very credible deal. A bespoke customs union with the EU and the trade arrangements would have achieved those things. It didn't go through Parliament. That's the problem.
So that's your preference then, rather than
That was
Remain?
what we put forward, and that obviously is why I put it forward. So my issue is also uniting people in the country. My party is the only one that has significant numbers of people who voted both Remain and Leave in the referendum. My party represents people all over the country. We want to bring people together, which is why I spend a lot of time listening to an awful lot of divergent views over this whole issue, and then we came up with the proposal that I put to our national executive and our party, which is what we have.
You say you talk about listening, you talk about trying to unite people, but isn't it also the time for leadership? People want to know what you stand for.
Leadership comes from listening. When you listen to people and then you take people forward with you, rather than dictate to them.
We hear a lot about what other people feel, Tom Watson, John McDonnell, Len McCluskey, speculation about people in your office. But this is why I'm saying the leadership question is crucial, isn't it? If you stand up and say, this is what we believe, this is what we're going to do, then people will follow.
We'll push for a referendum and there will be a decision made by the people of this country.
OK, OK. Now, we need to talk about anti-Semitism. This is your first major interview since the Panorama documentary. I don't know if you watched it. What did you think of it?
I was upset at the feelings of some of our former staff, what they'd said. I was upset at the way the programme was characterised and presented, and we have put in some complaints surrounding that. I'm very clear, there's no place whatsoever for anti-Semitism in our society, in our communities, or in my party. Since I became leader, I asked, and she did it, Shami Chakrabarti, to do a report into it and develop a process. When Jenny Formby took over as General Secretary, as successor to Ian McNicol, I asked her to deal with it in a speedy and timely manner. We recruited more staff and we improved our processes, and there were processes were going through 4 times faster. I also recognise that where there is prima facie evidence of serious abuse, then there is a need for a faster process. I looked into that and put it to the Shadow Cabinet, the Parliamentary Labour Party and the National Executive of my own party last week, and they agreed with me there had to be a faster process, which is now being developed into rules which go before this year's conference. We are very clear, we're not accepting any form of anti-Semitism in our party. We've also, by the way, adopted a definition on Islamophobia, and any other form of racism is totally unacceptable. We're completely open about that, and where it happens, and it has happened in cases of less than 0.1% of our membership, we deal with it.
Okay. Just to look at some of the allegations that former members of the Labour Party made in that documentary, they were talking about effectively interference in the process. I'm just going to read some of what they said. Kat Buckingham, I quit the party with nowhere to go and had a breakdown. Sam Matthews, I actively considered committing suicide. Louise Withers Green, I was signed off with depression and anxiety. I mean, how do you feel when you hear that?
I feel very sorry and very sad for them. The first thing I did when I became leader of the party was to ask the senior staff what processes were available for staff support because of stress at work. That was without anything to do with anti-Semitism, just the whole principles of stress at work. I feel very strongly about that, and that support has to be there. Some of those people had to work very hard. They were overwhelmed by cases, letters and so on. And remember, our party membership virtually
they felt they were being undermined.
Virtually
as well,
trebled. Well, they were being asked to work very fast on a lot of very complex issues, and in some cases they had to sift through a lot of things to find that actually the complainants sometimes weren't even Labour Party members.
Can you guarantee that since Jenny Formby became General Secretary, there's been no interference by you or anyone in your office on any
All we've
cases?
said is get the cases done as quickly as you can in a timely, fair and legally sustainable manner.
Okay. Now, what I don't understand when I look at the anti-Semitism story, we've talked about it before, you've spoken about it in interviews before, it's been going on for years now. Why don't you just set up an independent process to deal with it? That would then just stop all of this, wouldn't it? I mean, that's what people have called for. That's what, you know, for example, the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Leadership Council have called for. Why don't you just do it?
Nobody else has an independent process within their own organisations. What we do have is legal oversight of the process to ensure consistency in decision making, and when the Equalities and Human Rights Commission concludes its report, we will obviously listen very carefully to what they have to say. I do think there has to be a legally robust process. We also have a degree of independence in the party. We have something called the National Constitutional Committee, which is completely independent of me and the National Executive. They make the final decision.
Do you take responsibility?
I'm the leader of the party, therefore I must take responsibility for what happens in our party, and I'm absolutely determined our place has to be safe and welcoming, our party safe and welcoming to people of all faiths, all religions and all groups.
Do you think some on the left have a blind spot on anti-Semitism?
People in politics do sometimes cross the line and confuse issues and can dip into anti-Semitic tropes and language. That's why I've introduced an education programme with a substantial pack of education materials which has been sent out last week, so that we say to people, just be careful on your use of language. It is not acceptable. Look at the history of the growth of racism in this continent over the last century, and look now at the rise of the far right in Central Europe and indeed in Western Europe, and of course in the United States as well.
Okay, now we're talking at the end of a very busy week.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's been a busy week, all right.
It's been quite a busy week. What we saw, among other things, was more MPs appointed to Cabinet from ethnic minorities than we've ever seen before. I mean, admittedly, it's a pretty low bar. Is that something you welcome?
Well, I welcome diversity, of course, and I welcome that our Parliament is beginning to look a bit more like the rest of the population does, but it's got a long way to go. After all, in 1987, the first 4 black MPs were elected, and it was quite a while before substantially more joined them. Our shadow cabinet is extremely diverse, our team is extremely diverse, our party membership is extremely diverse, our society is very diverse. But you've got to start doing monitoring of all big organisations where you find diversity often at the lowest levels in any organisation, and that sort of diversity reduces and diminishes the nearer you get to the top of it. But it's also about education, it's about understanding, it's about history. So I'm very proud that Dawn Butler, our Shadow Equalities Minister, has produced the ideas and the Emancipation Education Trust, so we can understand something, our children can understand something more about how the slave trade came about, how the slave trade was opposed, and how eventually slavery was abolished.
I just want to read you a tweet that was sent by Shadow Minister Clive Lewis towards James Cleverly, who's the new party chairman at the Conservative Party. He congratulated him on the appointment and said, "I'm just sorry that you and other black members of the cabinet had to sell your souls and self-respect to get there." Do you think they sold their souls?
They're Conservatives, they believe in conservatism, they've been appointed in their party. I'd leave it at that. I want diversity at all levels in our society.
He also was talking about things that he thinks that Boris Johnson has said that are racist. Do you think Boris Johnson's racist?
Boris Johnson has said some awful comments about black children, about Muslim women, and about people within our society and our community, which I absolutely condemn. I hope he will understand the hurt that he caused with the remarks that he made.
While we're talking about diversity, we had the first female Liberal Democrat leader appointed this week as well. Labour's now the only party that hasn't had a woman leader. Is that something you should be ashamed of?
I'm not ashamed of it, but there will be a woman leader in the future, of that I'm very sure.
Would you like the next leader to be a woman?
Listen, one thing I've said is I ain't going to get involved in choosing that.
Okay.
Because I'm very happy in the job I'm doing, and I'm very determined to win the general election so we get a Labour government. But that Labour government will be gender balanced. There will be an equality or a majority in the cabinet of women, and there will be a very diverse cabinet around that table, because we represent all parts and all communities of this country. And
if that election isn't until 2022, will you still fight it?
I'm fine, I'm fit, I'm ready, I'm raring to go.
Jeremy Corbyn, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.